I'm also delighted to be able to finally talk about this book now that it's done, because I've been working on this for a very long time. It took 5 years of research and another year in post-production, and during that time I was giving lots of talks going, there's a book, I promise, it's really coming. So now at least I can go, hey, here's some of the things I found earlier. Right, I became interested in the Regency period through Jane Austen, through living where she had lived and worked and reconstructing the only known body garment, this pelisse, that had belonged to her. But as I was researching it, I realised how little there was actually out there in a scholarly manner on Regency dress. And so much of our conceptions of Austen and the Regency period are dominated by screen adaptations. If any of you have seen the recent Emma, for my money, it's the best costume screen Austen ever made. I'm just, passing that on there. Little bit too fashionable, but oh my goodness, the details. So I wanted to kind of look at Regency dress kind of somewhere between the letters of Jane Austen and the screen vision. What were people really wearing? What was the gentry wearing? What were... those of us who also read Georgette Heyer, there's a kind of like a romping, aristocratic, frothy experience of Regency life. But that's the sort of the top 5%. What were the people below them wearing? So how do we sort of get away from this idea of enacting history as the present in costume and go back to the past? Little review of Jane Austen's dates there. I know for some people they're kind of etched on the soul. But Austen was the daughter of a clergyman, and she gives us an introduction to a very sort of genteel, bourgeois, middle-class world. And it's a middle-class gentility that's concerned with etiquette and manners and status and respectability. And it's very much largely of southern England. If she had been more northern, like her successors, the Brontes, Mrs. Gaskell were, she would probably given us a different insight into life and society. But she is foremost a social commentator, and as dress is always a nuanced social marker, so clothing and needlework pinpoint niceties of character in her novels. And then in Austen's letters, they reveal a very lively sartorial interest, besides her concerns about how to dress well on a limited income. And I feel that one of the things that appeals to us, one of the enduring appeals about the Regency period, is perhaps it's the first time in history where we can look at people in the dress of the period and see ourselves in them. A lot of the excesses of the 18th century have been stripped away, and they become kind of more normal. We can start to see ourselves almost in a sense before they become curvy and large again in the Victorian period. It's kind of this little kind of the fog clears for a moment. And what's so interesting about using Jane Austen as the basis for a book is I approached her not just as this sort of monumental singular author, which she is, but because of the place that her work has in the English language and culture, she is also now figures as an exceptionally observant woman who is part of the best biographized, non-elite, middling late Georgian family that there is. And the more I looked into it, the more I realised what emerged repeatedly is just how typical the Austen family were as middle-class consumers. So their methods of acquiring and wearing and maintaining dress fall within the general patterns of the field of their status and income, and she models these fictional spheres very closely on her life experience. So I'm interested in kind of what's below the screen adaptations. If kind of our approaches to Jane Austen have created a certain image of her, we've also got this certain image of Regency dress, and what goes underneath? What keeps you warm? What do lumpy stockings feel like to walk on? How do you get through, manure-coated streets when horses are everywhere? I'm kind of interested in those sort of details that are a little bit beyond Colin Firth, rising like Venus out of the waves. So I was also very interested in kind of challenging a lot of the myths of Regency dress. Whenever I sort of looked at a book, the same stories kept coming up again and again, which is a little bit like, tales of Kim Kardashian going to the Met Ball being repeated as, what we're all wearing now. And stays and corsets are, I think, one of the big ones. So Regency myth number one is that women got rid of their corsets, got rid of their stays. First of all, let's see what we mean by stays and corsets, because it doesn't mean the same thing then as we think it means now. Stays were the normal English word for the woman's bust-supporting, shaping torso undergarment. So in the 18th century, that runs from your shoulder to your waist. And as we get into the Regency period, which I define in my book, I kind of use a long Regency in the historical sense. So I go about 1795 to about 1721, based on dress changes. And it starts to slip. So you can see here, can we see? Oh, laser pointer. We can see here that it starts to run from the bust to the hip, and it's going to begin to be the Victorian hourglass corset shape. And here we have a pair of transitional stays from the 1790s with the tabs and the boning patterns that were there before. So what actually happens is that the very heavily whalebone stays start to become lighter, so they become cotton. Lots of the boning reduces. You can see here that's actually using cotton cording as boning, and while they keep the centre busk, the boning becomes a lot lighter. So in fact, stays and corsets exist simultaneously, and corset is a French word that comes in. It means a little body. So you have these kind of lighter garments. So when you see records saying, oh yes, women aren't wearing stays, what they might mean is they're wearing corsets. It's just different garments. So the word corset is also used for kind of little sleeveless waistcoats that go out over gowns, and Emma is wearing them a lot in the new film of Emma. It's one of the beautiful dress details. But one of the great innovations of the Regency period is two breasts. This might not sound like much, but we've got two individual breasts here after about 3 centuries of kind of prow of the ship monobosom. So the fact that you can also see breasts has given rise to a lot of the conversations about them. So you do get pictures like this. Look, I track Regency nipples. What am I going to say? Like, you can see there's a lot of nipples going on. You start to see the body in different ways. So images like this do suggest that, you know, part of the scandals are true, that women are not wearing corsets and they've just thrown off all their underwear and everything's transparent and it's all very scandalous. But this is a period where naturalness is in fashion, the idea of a natural body or based on the antique. But what I kept finding was that it's based on a faked naturalness, the artifice of naturalness. And while this is in fact creating the impression that Jane Austen wrote about, she's got a very famous piece in a letter from 1813 where she says, "I learned to my high amusement that stays now are not made to force the bosom up at all. That was a very unbecoming, unnatural fashion." So all of those heaving bodices of Austen heroines in Screen is, you know, she thought that was funny. But have a look at what's going on here. This is a portrait by Thomas Lawrence, and she has indeed two bosoms with individual nipples. You're lucky I'm not using my own to demonstrate. It happens sometimes. And they look like there's nothing going on there, but also have a look at what's happening in the middle. She's got a brooch there, and we've got strain lines coming out here. You can't have a brooch holding something in between two breasts without something to pin it to. Therefore, she's wearing a corset or stays underneath. And actually what we've got here is the illusion of naturalness. So the stays or the corset is running up to under the bust. The nipples are free, but she's actually got things going on there. So what people are seeing is the effect of fashion, but perhaps not the reality of clothing. And so that's been amazing to sort of look at what women have done with their bosoms there. If you have seen Emma, this is where it comes from. I love this picture. I should say that if you have the book, which I hope if you don't have now, you might have later, I've delved in this for this presentation into my collection of images that didn't make it to the book, because I have many, many of those. And I was really digging for the unusual and the intimate and the unexpected. So here is a picture from an illustration to the Poetical Sketches of Scarborough in 1812, and you can see that she's still got quite a long bodice on with tabs here, but it does come underneath the bust, sort of leaving the breasts free. So there's a lot of experimentation with what they're doing about bust support throughout the Regency period. And then, yes, they didn't wear underwear there. So another thing that was really quite interesting for me and eye-opening was to discover how popular wigs were. And again, when we move from the 18th century, the idea that, 18th century wigs are very distinctive. They're grey, or they're white, and they're horsehair, and they're very obvious, and they're very large, and the men's, they look like George Washington. It's very fake. You can see that people are wearing wigs. And when I started looking into the Regency period, I realised they're still wearing exactly as many wigs as before. It's just that now they're natural hair coloured. So again, it's part of kind of the artifice of naturalism. And they're incredibly popular. So for me, a lot of the research was learning to see images differently and then explain them as well. This is obviously a fashionable lady in dress and undress, and you can see her wig on her head, but perhaps if we just saw that picture, we wouldn't read it as a wig. There's lots of records of women cutting off their own hair, especially as women start to go grey. They cut off the hair that's their natural colour, and then they have it made into hair pieces that can then, especially if they're wearing a turban, they might have just a fringe or curls peeping out that's their hair and their hair colour, but perhaps the hair that's not visible doesn't match that anymore. I think it's a very sensible solution. I've also seen records of women cutting off their daughter's hair to get the colour match, which is very interesting. But for men as well, the more I started looking at male portraits, this is Thomas Coutts, the banker who founded the bank that still exists today, the Queen Banks with Coutts. And I realised that I was seeing a lot of older gentlemen who had eyebrows that were different colours to their hair. And you can see when you sort of start to look at it, it's sitting slightly oddly on his head, and he's actually wearing a wig. So all throughout this kind of early 19th century period, they are still wearing wearing wigs. It's also warmer. If you think about it, it acts like a fur cap, and heating is not so strong or effective in this period. It's actually, especially if you're getting older, very good way to keep your head warm. Dorothea Jordan, the mistress of the Duke of Cumberland, who became George IV, she bought a wig on that basis. She thought it was thought it was warmer. So yes, once I started looking at that, you can see that they're still faking it. It's just not as obvious as in the 18th century. Another thing I really wanted to do with the book was kind of look at the place of needlework in women's lives, because there's often a kind of a disparaging attitude towards needlework, perhaps more now. The idea of, it's very much a trope in, say, young adult fiction, or I think of things like Merida in the film Brave, where the heroine, she doesn't want to stay at home doing boring needlework or embroidery. She's going to learn to, fire arrows, or ride a horse, or fight just like the boys, because she's a feisty modern woman, TM. And I just sort of think it does a great disservice to all of these women whose lives were filled with sewing for themselves, for friends, also for supervising their employees' work. For most, gentry women have servants who are doing a lot of the sewing as well. And it occupied a large part of their time. I'm a sewer, so I like to sort of, look at how this clothing is being made. And in Austen, she actually brings very nice distinctions to her needlework. Her very fine or flighty ladies don't undertake domestic sewing, and they content themselves instead with decorative efforts, which is kind of sort of useless and sometimes not even very beautiful. But heroines engage in practical and useful work, as it's called, and it's always known as work, or if you see work, it means that it's sewing. And they did take work bags. They're taken with them in carriages and drawing rooms, and all the time they're in those kind of social scenes, they're sewing, which Austen only sometimes sort of lets us into. But all of these things like the work baskets here, they were an extension of women's personal spaces that they're taking around with them, and it could be quite important kind of private moments. And I also very interested in the sheer level of technical skill that is, again, under-recognised. This is a man's shirt, and generally the women of a family made the shirts for their menfolk. So there's a letter of 1796 where Austen talks about making shirts for her brother James, and she's pleased to say she's the neatest worker of the party. You can also see here, this has got the pleating of the shirt sleeves, which is very common to get them into those tight jacket sleeves, but the quality of sewing that was available to them, that could be done. This is it's humble. This is the shirt from Thomas Coutts, the banker, white on white. You don't think very much about it. This to this is an inch. There are 50 stitches to the inch. It's 0.5 millimetre long in metric, and it's finer than I've ever seen a modern sewing machine make, which is what Austen's nephew said. He said that her sewing would almost have put a sewing machine to shame. She was such a fine worker. So it's, it really is extraordinary. And when women got together to sew, to do all of this, it was very much an important place for sociability and for networking and for fostering acquaintanceship networks of the kind that Austen is always revealing to us. I think it's also pertinent that, Austen was a brilliant needlewoman. This is not a great picture, but it's the best I've got, of her own satin stitch. She was considered especially great in the satin stitch, and this is a handkerchief she embroidered for her sister. This is her writing, and this is her painting on a little needle book. And all of it is consistently neat, fine, precise, and exact. The way she does one thing is the way that she does everything. And I'm also interested there's a lot of evidence for sewing as a place for reflection and thinking. And one of the arguments against sewing is that, it's drudgery and mindless and takes long hours. But there's records of Jane Austen sitting, her niece remembered that she'd be sitting working in a corner, and all of a sudden she'd laugh to herself, jump up, go to a piece of paper and write something down, and then go and sit back and work again. And I'm thinking that she's actually honing her sentences in her head while she's working. It's very, all this kind of the colouring and mindfulness that we do now, I think that's what sewing does. And I think that this, extraordinary acts of creation that she produced are not opposite to her sewing. It's all the same thing, and all of that creativity is feeding each other. So, yeah, I argue for that. I was also very interested in how women actually got clothes. This is not a period of ready-made clothing. So I mined a lot of dressmakers' bills to see how clothing is actually going together. How do you buy clothes in the Regency? This is one of the few illustrations of a woman being fitted by a dressmaker. But this is a bill from Eliza Jarvis, who was the wife of an MP. She had properties in Hampshire and in Wiltshire. And once the costs break down in interesting ways, because making a dress is 7 shillings, but then trimming it is separate, lining it is separate, ribbon is separate, the packing case is separate, the bodices, which is kind of the fitting part underneath, is separate. It's kind of a modular list of accumulated costs. It's not just art dressed, because Regency consumers they knew about the fabric, they knew about the quality, they knew about the making. And when they're looking at other people's clothing, they're applying economic considerations as well as kind of style ones. So they all break down into various costs that make a gown altogether. But the making cost is actually, it's not very much. 7 shillings works out at about, what would it be today? Probably about $30. So that's to make by hand a whole dress. And I can't quite work out how dressmakers made any profit. So I'm still sort of working on that, but it's great to see those costs broken down. I was also very interested in shopping habits, and this is the account book of Mrs. Topham, which I found in Chawton House Library, which is in the village where Jane Austen lived her last days and revised and published her novels. And it has this, it's kind of like a daily or weekly account record, which is just full of random bits of wonderful clothing. So, 2 pairs of walking black shoes, and then she's got her salts, and she's buying bits of green ribbon and a bottle of Vancouver water cologne, I think. And it goes on like this for a long, long time. Mrs. Topham lived in London, and all of these shops with their kind of new display windows, there's this wonderful sense of her just kind of going out, and she buys a little bit of ribbon for this and a little bit of ribbon for that. And you can see her putting together outfits. She'll buy a piece of fabric for a Spencer, and then she buys the ribbon, and then she buys the braid and the trimmings, and then a little bit later she might buy some more green dye, so clearly she's got to buy the ribbon. And there's a sense of a kind of a rolling accumulation of clothing, which doesn't come out through the images. I was also interested in looking at other kind of forms of retailing. So this again is from Poetical Sketches of Scarborough, and I love this, quite sort of humble shoemakers. That's also the sales shop, the sales room, but it's clearly not particularly about the display. This is from the maker himself. So we've got a woman in a riding habit wearing her riding boots, and then the normal footwear there as well. So once I'd kind of looked at how clothing breaks down, I became more and more interested in the role of trimming. In Emma, when Mrs. Elton talks about how do you like the trimming on my gown, I have a great horror of being over-trimmed, which they beautifully display in the new film of Emma. This kind of, the idea that you make the gown and then you trim the gown was really important for me, because then I started looking at, I love this woman in yellow, she's unknown, but I love her for the quantity of haberdashery. She's got ribbons and buckles and cording and braiding and gauze and lace and more ribbon and lace and more lace. And this kind of, all of these bits and pieces, which are from pieces that I looked at while I was researching, the idea of kind of putting decoration onto clothing was really important. Your gown was different to your trimming. And when you look at Austen's letters, she and Cassandra are constantly talking about how to trim things, and I'm going to change this, I'm going to add ribbons here. And it's kind of, it's like sort of the current of fashion washing over the structures of clothing. And as you get into the later 18 teens, more haberdashery becomes more cheaply available, and so you get more of it on clothing, and it loses the austerity of the 1810s. It also explains the importance of bonnets. Lydia Bennet buying a bonnet that she may as well buy as not in Pride and Prejudice, and then she has to spend more money on it to trim it new. And again, so we've got the concept of a sort of a structure and then trimming on the structure. Mostly on bonnets they were pinned, all the decorations, so it was easily changed. And then also the importance of caps. A lot of the sewing that women are doing is small gifts for friends, caps for themselves, and these accessories were a way of kind of changing the fashionability of your wardrobe without having to invest in a new gown. So all of that kind of, the peripherality of what we look at now as perhaps stylistic decoration, it was a really important way of engaging with clothing in the period. The issue of style as well, this is where we get things like the difference between England and France. I can now see French fashion in fashion plates, but it's taken me a long time to work it out. And to give you an idea of the difficulty, this is a French plate that has, so these ladies are English girls dressed in the French fashion, and these ladies are French girls dressed in the English fashion. Which would have been very, very obvious to people at the time, but kind of pulling out those nuances and why a dress from Paris was so desirable, but not too desirable, because the French were very vulgar, and the French thought that English were really quite boring and had these long historical waists, whereas it was up much higher here. So those kind of nuances of trying to explore how Regency people actually saw and experienced clothing, which is very different from the fashion plate definition. And Austen herself, she's very fond of the word elegant, which I think the nearest thing we have here is kind of style or chic. And the idea that, fashion is fashion, but the gentry were trying to sort of adopt it to themselves and find a middle way between not being too fashionable, but not being too out of style, to be appropriate to oneself. And again, Emma is a beautiful example of this. Jane Fairfax is repeatedly referred to as elegant, whereas Mrs. Elton is, and this is a fantastic burn, as elegant as lace and pearls could make her. So the kind of, how to make the best of one's assets and choose, because you're choosing all of your clothing from, the fabric up, how to make that bring forward the best of you, but negotiate fashionability as well, with the refinement of manner was quite a complicated business. So to achieve style required a lot more thought, which Jane Austen sometimes got tired of. She did say at one point, I've got to get a new gown. How I wish these things were to be bought ready-made. Yes. So apparently there were also men in the Regency. Who knew? And one of the great influences, while English countrymen's style had been fashionable across the continent from the late 18th century in what's known as Anglomania, what we have really coming to the fore in menswear in the Regency period is almost what we can think of as like a casualisation of clothing, where sportswear becomes acceptable in more formal situations. And this really comes about from the influence of riding dress. So the capes on a coachman or a groom's coat, the jockey cap, which also appeared in women's dress. Jane Austen had a riding cap made out of straw in 1813. One moment. And the influence, of the sort of the stout woolen clothing that was used for men's riding dress and the boots that came with that as well, started to find their way into male fashion. So the kind of the casual country squire look, beautifully put together. This is the look that Beau Brummel is promoting, and it's kind of very, very plain, but very, very simple and perfect when well done. I'm also interested in ways of Regency singing. Have a look at how tightly his coat is buttoned. There's a tightness to clothing at the time that doesn't necessarily get reproduced on screen because it's uncomfortable for the actors, but how they felt in their clothing and how they kind of snuggled up in it, and also much colder. We're at the end of the Little Ice Age, and as I've said, inefficient internal heating makes a difference. So when you get wonderful pictures like Richard Dighton's series of the City of London, it's tens if not hundreds of plates drawn from life about how, although the template of men's dress is less varied than women's, it still has great individuality in it, in the way that their coats fall, in the way that they sit. And as people had fewer clothes as well, there was more association of individual clothing with an individual. You could know a man by the set of his coat. It's not so bright here, but an important thing to note about all these most of these coats too, is that they've got raw edges. The wool is so heavily fulled that it's more like felt. You can cut very crisp, neat edges into it at the side. So wool has always been Britain's great sort of economic export since the Middle Ages. But all of this woolen clothing and the kind of the sports clothing, as it were, the influence of riding dress, is coming about with a new mobility. The roads are improving, carriage technology is improving. Maria Edgeworth, a novelist whose letters I drew on greatly, she's a wonderful source. She talks in the 1810s about, with the post being so fast and the roads so good and the carriages so quick, it's almost like the fairies, and we can all see and know what each other are doing at the same time. And that's 200 years before smartphones, so it's all relative. But there's kind of the open carriages and the exigencies of travel. Women are wearing riding habits. So this is from 1795, a slightly earlier style. But to travel, to take all these journeys, they're wearing carriage dress, they're wearing riding dress. It's often made of the same kind of wools, and male tailors are making women's pelisses and riding habits as well. One of the questions I used to get asked the most was, how did people keep warm? And I think this is very much a question that also comes from the logistics of filming period dramas, because it's much easier to film them in summer when the weather's lovely. So we kind of get the romping in muslin dresses through quite warm fields, except when Marianne Dashwood needs to catch a cold kind of approach, and then in comes the rain. But the women could have had a lot of outer garments, their pelisses, redingotes, fur tippets, cloaks, all sorts of things that they can wear. And again, Maria Edgeworth provides my favourite example of just how much clothing people could wear, which was, she's in an open carriage in November in the north of England, and she says, I was well wrapped up. First, my grey cloth gown, cloth meaning wool. Secondly, a furred pelisse. Third, a red shawl. Fourthly, a large fur tippet. Besides all these coverings, I had a great box coat over my knees. In short, I was warm as a dormouse. So it was possible to keep warm. Again, something I really like about the new Emma is also the presence of the red cloaks, which don't get shown so much. They were thought to be a quite peculiarly English fashion, although they appear here in America as well. Linda Baumgarten's books on colonial clothing have got some lovely examples of them. But this kind of country cloaks for stomping awkwardly through mud, that's watercolour of the time, also were keeping warm and were quite an English fashion. But one of my favourite things that I discovered throughout the research was flannel underwear. Boy, I love flannel underwear. So wool flannel, creamy coloured. I thought it was red, but it's mostly this sort of natural colour. Here's Dr. Flannel offering a woman a petticoat to cover her loins, and she says, "I have no loins, sir." And basically, so underneath a lot of their clothing, Regency people are wearing thermal underwear. And it's wool flannel. For men, you have, it's called a waistcoat, but it's like a shirt. Colonel Brandon wears one in Sense and Sensibility, which Marianne Dashwood uses to exaggerate his extreme decrepitude at 35. But they are kind of having, so they've got petticoats, drawers, stays for women. They've got warm clothing on underneath, which is not depicted nearly enough. And for men as well, so here's a pair of flannel drawers. But here, this is an extract from Female Patriotism, where they're dressing an army man in flannel. It was very important for keeping warm, and lots of guides to the army are basically say, when in doubt, wear flannel. Are you going to the tropics? Flannel for temperature regulation. You're going to sea? It will keep you warm and dry at sea. You're going to somewhere cold? Take flannel to keep warm. And it just appears again and again and again as almost a tool of health in the period. But it is also another of the kind of the influences of military dress. This is a period, a very bellicose period. And for men, the influences from army clothing are significant and long-lasting. So things like pantaloons, which are tight ankle-length trousers, as opposed to breeches, which are knee-length. Things like the stock, which is a stiffened neck support or band. Boots, the acceptability of wearing boots in town, not just in the country and riding horses. And lots of the decoration, like the braiding and the high collars and the shako hats, they appear in women's as well as men's dress. So even the idea of the spencer, so that, one of the iconic garments of the Regency period, the short jacket, it originally came from male clothing, so a tailcoat with the tails cut off. And again, stories about its invention vary, and it's often attributed to George Spencer, the fourth Earl of Marlborough, but as far as I can tell, it was actually invented by his brother Charles. And Charles Spencer was the captain of the Oxfordshire militia, in which Jane Austen's brother Henry was a colonel, and they were friends. So the man who invented one of the iconic Regency garments was really good friends with the brother of the iconic Regency author, which I love. And so this is George IV before he got ridiculously fat in hussar uniform. He just loved the pageantry of clothing and the details of the pantaloons. So you can see how they outline the body, and yes, I have a corresponding file to nipples for men. All of the braiding here, that military effect, that appears throughout women's dress. But there's a difference between the full military effect and its adoption into everyday wear. So the adoption by the dandy and then by the city man. So he's wearing pantaloons with boots and a tailcoat, and it's a very, very different effect depending on how exaggerated one wanted to be. And so the accessories of men's clothing, they were generally stouter than women's. Men have got much tougher boots. So you can see the Hessian and the jockey and the Wellington. And the hats as well. The top hat has come through by this period. And even though you've got less variation, you still have a subtlety of variation throughout. So subtlety of identity. And there is a bit in Emma where Emma is convinced that she can see Mr. Elton's love for Harriet Smith, even in the air, the sitting of his hat. So this kind of, the expression of men's clothing was still kind of being read as much as women's. Another direct invention from the military is Cossack trousers. This is a drawing from life of one of the Cossack troops who joined the Tsar of all the Russias in 1814 to celebrate the apparent defeat of Waterloo. And the pleated tops with the strap under the ankle, under the instep, became very much a part of men's fashion, and especially throughout the 1820s. But it was literally taken directly from the Cossacks that they saw. The longest lasting influence, however, comes from the sea, which is trousers. So where pantaloons are tight-fitting at ankle length, trousers are looser at ankle length. And they're a street fashion that became normalised. And where trousers had been used, especially by sailors, by working men for almost a century at that point, the heroism of the Navy and the esteem with which the Navy was held really meant that trousers started, and the number of sort of sailors offshore, trousers started to become acceptable clothing. I mean, the Duke of Wellington was barred from the very exclusive club Almack's in 1817 for wearing trousers in the evening when it wasn't, you're still supposed to be wearing knee breeches. But they generally come up from this period, and from the 1820s, they're well established. So men wear trousers now because of 18th century sailors, essentially. We do get some very splendid sailors. This is Captain Gilbert Heathcote, this is his portrait celebrating his being made captain in 1806, the same year that Captain Wentworth was in Persuasion. And then the division on land as well. And Austen's two of her brothers were in the Navy, and they were incredibly important. The British Navy was incredibly important for dominating at sea. While they're also blockading most of Europe, they're going off and taking lots of the trade, a little bit of a war with America. Just basically ruling the waves while trying to stop Napoleon as well. And so what you have, and what I really sort of wanted to encompass in the book, is a sense of Britain as the world. Again, with Austen, there's often a sort of a local, high tea, oh, Mr. Darcy, very kind of small, rural, cloistered attitude towards her. But she was in contact with the world. And as you get people travelling to the colonies in the East Indies, in the West Indies, in Australia, it was very exciting to me to work on a period where my country existed. Australia was founded in 1788 with white settlement that has a long 60,000 years of indigenous culture before that. And I generally work on earlier periods, so you're like, hey, I have a country, was small thrill. So this is on board an East Indiaman, but how Britons travelled and what they did with the clothing when they did travel was quite it was interesting to me, as well as the fact that so much of Regency clothing depended on global dress and global trade. So the white muslin dress, which is very much the little white dress of the period, it comes from India. It's invented there, it's imported from there, and so much of the industrial innovation and revolution that happens at the time is from British manufacturers trying to compete with Indian quality. So the quality could be absolutely extraordinary. This is Princess Charlotte's shirt. She was the daughter of George, the Prince of Wales, and if she hadn't died, she would have been Queen instead of Queen Victoria. And I mean, it's absolutely incredible. It's like air or water. So it's that kind of desirability that they're trying to imitate. But I also found references to something that has made me rethink the high-waisted dress. This period of classicism that comes through in the 1790s is generally and always attributed to classical influence. This is from Thomas Hope's. He did designs for modern costumes, and he put out a lot of books based on his own collections of Greek and Roman and Egyptian antiquities. And the connections between sort of the white classical columnar woman and the Greek dress or Roman dress, it's throughout the literature. But as muslin is coming in, what we also have is, in India, the chole comes right underneath the bust. And in the Mughal areas, you look at the men's dress and it's white muslin with a lot of gathering and it's high-waisted. And I found a period reference from an old India hand who'd lived there for 30 years, and he said the current fashion of women's dress is based on a particular style from northern India. And once I started looking at it, I went, oh yeah, funny that. The place where the fabric comes from also has the same style. So I'm interested in expanding on this and looking further. But at the same time, this transparency that comes through from muslin that kind of gets consumers used to being see-through, it's inspiring a whole lot of innovation in the forms of net. Lace-making machines and netting machines are coming through in this period. So fabric goes transparent and gauzy in a new way. And so you get a lot of coloured slips being worn underneath net gowns or gauze gowns that change the fabric of it. You get a lot gowns being made of almost nothing. You have gauze with all of this haberdashery on it from sort of the 1815 onwards period. period. And they do this again very well in the new Emma. She changes the colour of her muslin dress by putting different petticoats underneath it. The shawls coming in from India, again, shawls are so classic to the Regency period, but they are inspiring British manufacture and the imitations thereof. So you have a kind of a dichotomy of value between real Indian muslins and British muslins, real Indian shawls and British shawls. But what is also happening here, so you've got lots of, Navy men, lots of East India men going out to India and bringing them back, and you also have a ton of smuggling. My other favourite thing that I discovered, the extent to which the British Regency gentry cheerfully smuggled as a normal thing, including the Austen family. If naval men got what was called a privilege, so it's a tax-free perk, they could bring in stuff tax-free. But this is Fanny Austen, Jane Austen's sister-in-law. She was born in Bermuda. She was raised she lived in Halifax, which is where she met Charles Austen, and then she lived with him on his ship in the Channel. So when her sister sends her box from Bermuda, she just sends a boat out, takes it off the official ship, brings it back to her ship, divides up the parcel, and then sends it on to her parents in London so that we don't have to deal with any of that customs nonsense. And I've got a whole bit on smuggling, because basically the idea that France and England were separated by the Channel and they had no fashion commerce is totally belied by the extent to which people are smuggling as a normal consumptive practice. And the extent Napoleon's supporting it, the British government's supporting it, it's all going on. And it makes me quite happy to think of these sort of gleefully just, moving stuff about. Which also brings us to things like the shawls. So in Mansfield Park, the only thing Lady Bertram really gets excited about is the thought that William Price might be able to bring back a couple of India shawls for her. She's excited because they'll be tax-free. That's what she wants. And so when you get pictures like Hannah More or this unknown lady who always reminds me of Miss Bates in Emma, they're both wearing shawls. At this point, they could be British imitation or they could be real Indian ones. And when Miss Bates is talking about Mrs. Bates's shawl, she said it was a present from Weymouth. And Weymouth is on the English Channel, and therefore it could well have been smuggled in. So the kind of the nuances and the consumption of shawls in that way is quite, there's a lot going on that we might not necessarily read at first go. But to give you an extent of kind of the global possibilities of fashion connected with Jane Austen, her brother Frank was stationed out in China and India for some years, and in 1810, in August, he escorted, it was a military escort for 13 East India ships making their way back to England. And so Fanny Palmer Austen, she talks about to her sister, she says to her sister in September 1810, "We shall send you a part of our brother Frank's China present and hope it will prove acceptable." And what she means is she's sending her a length of silk China crepe, which is lovely. So Fanny is sending silk China crepe across to her sister I can't remember if she's in Halifax or Bermuda. But Jane Austen and Cassandra Austen also have silk crepe dresses, and they don't appear in the letters before 1810. So I'm assuming that Frank has bought genuine silk crepe, and then he stopped in at India as well, and he's brought it all the way home, and he's given it to Jane and Cassandra Austen, and he's also sent stuff across the Atlantic. That's one textile for at least 4 women through one man that covers half the globe. And it's those kind of connections that we just don't see so much in textiles. But once you start unpacking it, and you also think about, Jane Austen sitting at home wearing genuine China crepe, or her other brother Charles he was in India for 5 years. Did he bring them back shawls? There's a kind of a direct connection with the world. Although she didn't leave England, she is essentially linked into it. She talks about kangaroos in her letters. She's seen pictures of kangaroos. She knows what's going on. And once we start to sort of open up that textile transmission, it's literally a whole world of fashion. So I'm just going to end there, and with one of my favourite pictures of the period, Relinda Sharple's The Assembly, The ball at the Clifton Assembly Rooms, painted in 1817. And it's just the most fantastic details of a ball. It's not very big and it's not really in great condition, but the details are gorgeous. The caps with lots of fake flowers with the ribbons, the fans, the turbans, you know, her little bit of hair peeping out. Is that real hair or is that a hairpiece? Mr. Hot Stuff in the front there, he knows it. He's wearing these boots that when you look more closely, they're Hessians, but they've got, look, bright silver gilt braid up the top and a red heel in buff boots. And look at the way, like, that's showed off. He knows what's going on. The chapeau bras held under the arm, the Limerick tan gloves, the way that the gauze dresses fall over the silk slips. It's a whole world of clothing to be read sort of economically, culturally, in forms of acquaintanceship, as complex identities for Regency people. So I hope that in the book that I have conveyed some of that world and how Jane Austen beautifully brings it to life and how they are inherently interlinked. I'm going to stop there to give you some time for questions. Thank you so much for listening, and if you want to know more, buy the book. Thank you.